Hello, my name is Olivia Armstrong and I'm a professional storyteller. I tell stories to children, to adults, to community groups. I work in lots of different museums and libraries. And on this project, I was working on Spellbound stories with Malcolm Gaskill at UEA and on Talisman Tales with Sophie Page of UCL. So the first session, Spellbound Stories, that was told as a first-person narrative detailing the life of a 17th century cunning woman called Anne Bodenham. And I wanted to portray the complexity of the character and to make her a sympathetic character, but also let people know that she was a woman who had agency, who had power, who had some control, although the story takes place at the moment where she's imprisoned just before her execution. And the other session was Talisman Tales, and for that session I was using objects that were on display in the Spellbound exhibition, and I picked out 3 objects and I asked children what they thought the objects might be, and I asked them if they'd any experience of magic or what they thought magic was, and then I spoke about the history of the objects. So one of them was a pilgrim badge, so I talked about pilgrims, I talked about St Michael, ideas of St Michael and saving your soul and being a saint to protect you, and then I used folk tales and matched them to the objects as well to add another dimension to the objects and give them another sort of sense of life. And with both sessions I used lots of sensory objects. So I used things that the children could smell. I used frankincense oil in one of the rituals that we recreated. I used rose petals. I used flowers and herbs. And I invited the audience to take the herbs. It was very interactive so that everyone could feel included. And I think when you use sensory elements, it almost lets the audience invest more in what they're listening to, and it's sort of, they're investing in it on a very visceral level rather than an intellectual level, so they feel more committed to the story. I had some knowledge and a great deal of interest, but I think in terms of thinking about witchcraft, perhaps I had more of an understanding of the persecution of witches, because I've done storytelling before in Colchester Castle Jail, where some witches were held during the witch trials before their execution. So I had an understanding of that side of history, but to read these stories of characters like Anne Bodenham really gave me more of an emotional understanding and an understanding of how it's so much more complex than I thought, because these characters did have agency, they did have power. And with medieval magic, it was something that I knew a little bit about, but not in great depth. So I'd heard of the music of the spheres and cosmos, and I knew a little bit about magical objects, but just sort of very surface knowledge. But I had a great desire to know more, because the whole idea of magic and witchcraft really appeals to me. So talking with Malcolm Gaskill initially at a meeting at the British Library, he had already written an article on Anne Bodenham, and he suggested that she might be a character to look at. He sent me lots of information on other witches and other cunning women, almost like a who's who of like 17th century magical women, but Anne Bodenham was the one that I think interested us both the most, because she had a ready-made narrative. There was lots of documentation about her, which was quite unusual. So you could tell her whole history. There was a story of how she'd worked as a servant for another cunning man, an astrologer called Dr Lamb, who had connections with King James. So there's a lot of backstory, so that was absolutely fascinating, and I was able to draw on that and draw on those narratives to develop the character. And Sophie Page sent me the exhibition catalogue, and she sent me some essays that she had written, as well as links to books that might be of interest for me to read. And it was really wonderful having Sophie nearby, because I'd often meet with her at the British Library and she could answer any of my questions, and she had a real ability to, obviously she kind of has great knowledge and knows everything, but she was able to disseminate that knowledge and make it very clear so that I could understand it. And also with the exhibition catalogue, it's written so beautifully, the essays there, that they're written with a real beauty and a simplicity, because I'm far from an expert in anything, in any story that I tell. So I need to have an understanding so that then I can perform it in such a way that I'm making it clear for an audience, so it's not an academic lecture, but it's a performance. And Malcolm also made me a very beautiful spell book. The first one went missing in the post, so I think there's a witch somewhere in London who's kind of studying Malcolm's spells, but it was a wonderful prop and it really fascinated children and adults alike. And when I was using it in the storytelling, I think people actually thought it was an authentic book because it looked so wonderful, and it was great to have that to capture people's imagination. And Sophie had made for me a replica of the Mirror of Florin, and again I was able to use that and find out the story of Florin, find out the ritual, which I was then able to perform with the children in the audience, and they were able to hold the mirror, and again it looked very authentic. So it was a wonderful prop to kind of bring more life to the stories. So in some of the documents, they're obviously written in the past, from like several hundred years ago, so the language could be quite complex, and it was quite difficult for me to unravel the chain of events that led to Anne Bodenham's imprisonment. I had to read it several times and just sort of write down the timeline and get it clear in my head what was happening. And with the Talisman Tales, when I was reading about ideas of the soul and ideas of the cosmos, these are incredibly complicated ideas, so I needed to be able to have an understanding myself and then be able to interpret it for an audience that was intended to be a family audience, but obviously lots of children there. And then my duty as a storyteller is to make it very entertaining as well, so to have a performance element, so to put all of those things together. And I also wanted to ensure that Anne Bodenham's character had the complexity that she deserved. So I wanted to show that she had her own agency, she had her own power, but there's an ambiguity there, you know, and because the things that have been written about her haven't been written by her, it's also that idea of who's telling the story, what's the truth of it? We're never going to know the truth of it, so how can I portray all the different ideas of truth and make it a sort of cohesive whole and portray that sympathy? But that was a wonderful challenge to be able to do that and to be able to try and bring a voice to this character. And with the Talisman Tales, again, it was wonderful to be able to find the stories that match the objects and perform them for other people to enjoy. With Sophie and the Talisman Tales, I think it was absolutely fascinating to be able to discover more about the objects on display and being able to find folk tales and myths that matched the objects was a really rewarding thing, because it was like the perfect fit in some cases. For example, with the Pilgrim Badge again, I found a story about St Michael and the devil battling for someone's soul. And with the Mandrake root, which was also an object that I looked at, I found an Eastern European story about a mandrake baby. So it was really wonderful to be able to perfectly match story with object and then deliver it. And then with the Spellbound stories, it felt like a great privilege to be able to bring to life a woman who hadn't had her voice heard, who wasn't able to tell her own story, whose story was told by others. And when I performed the Anne Bodenham character, I really felt that sense of power, and it felt like justice, that she was being brought into the present, being brought to life, and asking the children and the audience complicated questions. You know, what is a witch? Was the treatment of her fair? What would you do? And letting her live again for a moment. And that felt like a really wonderful, powerful thing. think it's made me realise how complex it is and how many contradictions there are, and how in history, even in a particular country at a particular time, there isn't one uniform voice of people of the past, that people are believing different things at the same time and holding contradictory thoughts at the same time. And that was quite a difficult thing to understand and to interpret. Yeah, it's just made me realise how much there is to learn. So I think I need to go and attend Malcolm and Sophie's lectures and find out more. That would be a real joy to do that. Well, I feel really proud to have been able to develop the character of Anne Bodenham and bring her to life. And that's given me a real sense of emotion, because it was very moving to portray this character, because she was real and these things did happen to her and it wasn't just a story. So that gave me a real emotional understanding of that character in her time. And I felt that since, I felt a real affection for this person and a real connection as well, and therefore a real connection with that period of history and with witches and cunning women in particular. And with the Talisman Tales, it's completely fascinating to see how objects have their history, but they also have their connected stories as well. And that's really something that I really like to look into more as well when I'm telling stories and folk tales, is linking to specific objects from history. And I just feel that I've been so lucky to meet Malcolm and Sophie and Marina and James, and to work with you and to be able to work in the Ashmolean and to work on such a groundbreaking, beautiful exhibition was a real privilege and a joy. And I've just felt really happy throughout to be a part of it, part of something so magical. Well, it's obviously deepened my interest, but I have to say that I've always been a magical thinker, and I think that's how the project found me, because as a storyteller, I believe in magic. I'm open to all sorts of things, and I think that some people don't believe in magic. What boring lives they must lead. They call me Mistress Bodenham, Mistress Anne Bodenham. So that shows that I'm a woman of some importance, that I have some power in the village. For most women in my time are playing good wife or goody, but Mistress Bodenham is what they calls me. That Mr. Bower, he comes here every day, and he says they're calling me something else. He says they be telling stories about me in the village, how they've seen me in the fullness of the silver moon, and how I was changing my shape. First, I was a black bear, and then a white lion, a cat, and a dog. And he says, they say that by my powers and skills, I can lift any man 40 miles an hour up into the air. Have you guessed yet what they calls me? A witch. That's not a word I would use about myself. A cunning woman, a healer, a helper, a woman skilled in the arts of conjuration. But they calls me witch, and they're afraid. I live in Fisherton Anger, not so far that you can't hear the chimes of the Salisbury Cathedral, but far enough from the riches of that city. Where I live, round me, there are mills that are clanking and creaking. You can smell the bricks and the ovens firing them all through the summer, the smoke and soot rising up. And then this building, this jailhouse, that's here squatting like a toad. But you would know the prettiest place in Fisherton Anger. That's my little house, with my garden, with all the herbs a-blowing and a-growing. I know them all. Sage, rosemary, bittersweet nightshade. I gather them when the moon sails across the sky like a ship on a stormy sea. I know all the herbs that heal and all the herbs that harm.